Welcome everyone to this special chance to talk to the director of Clash on Keefer, Chester Sitt, who's with us. We also have two UBC Instruct students, Stanley Chia and Patrick Leong, who had the chance to work with Chester and his team on the film, helping with interviews and background research. And so we're happy to have them here today also as part of the conversation. But for those who don't know, I'm Henry Yu. I teach history at the University of British Columbia, and I'm part of various Chinatown-related initiatives and projects, and including the Legacy Stewardship Group that was formed in the wake of the City of Vancouver's public apology for its history of anti-Chinese legislation. And that was in 2018. There was a formal public apology, and then the Chinatown Transformation Team was created at that time to basically come up with a management plan for Chinatown. So I'm a part of those efforts, as well as University of British Columbia has an MOU with the Chinatown Transformation Team to help with research and background. But separate from that is a relationship we have with Chester Sitt and Dynastic Entertainment, who made Clash on Keefer, where we had some funding from the federal government My Tax program to work with Chester, so our students could learn about filmmaking, and we could also help out in terms of just doing some of the historical research that would help his film. So welcome everyone. I want to acknowledge first that I am coming to you from the unceded territory of Musqueam. That it's a traditional ancestral territory of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh that the University of British Columbia and the City of Vancouver sits on, but I'm coming to you from the campus of the University of British Columbia, which is on the unceded territory of Musqueam. I know many of you are calling from different places, and so please take a moment to think about and acknowledge the Indigenous territories that you are benefiting from and living on. Often, as I said, for my own family, even though we came here 5 generations ago, that my family are uninvited guests, despite my being born here in British Columbia on unceded territory. So just as an introduction, we were really happy at UBC to be able to work with Chester, because Chester had worked on a wonderful film about the Chinese in the gold rush in British Columbia, and I had the privilege of being one of the people that Chester talked to. And so when he suggested that he wanted to make a film about the 105 Keefer struggle that really dated between about 2015 to 2018, so a 3-year-long struggle. We jumped at the opportunity because it was, for me as a historian, one of the iconic moments, and that in the days and years to come that people look back, this was a really turning point for Chinatown. And so please welcome Chester Sitt to the conversation with the director. I guess first I'll open up, Chester, with we've had, as part of Chinatown Reimagined, the chance for actually registrants to that conference to actually watch a special preview. And so just for those of you who perhaps want to get a chance to do that for the next couple hours, if you're watching us live, you can still catch a special preview. Over 700 views already. So a lot of interest in this film, and a lot of people took advantage of this special chance to preview. If you're watching this recorded, in the days and weeks and months after we had a chance to record this conversation, you'll have to see it on TELUS Optic, or through one of their TELUS Originals streaming. But for now, you have and so we're going to drop into the chat the link for you to still have a chance to watch a preview. But for those who haven't had a chance to watch the film, Chester, tell us about Clash on Keefer, and why you made this film, and what led you to get involved.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Dr. Yu. I just first I want to say thank you to you and your team for your hospitality, for inviting me to participate, and also for all of UBC's help in helping make Clash and Keefer a reality. Especially Stanley and Patrick, who are great and great help in helping us to do all the research we needed, along with extra interviews and production work. So Clash and Keefer ultimately is about an empty parking lot. The empty parking lot at the center of Vancouver's Chinatown was the heart of Chinatown. You know, like when you go there, you see that next to it is the Chinese Cultural Center. On the other side is the Chinese War Memorial. And little known, and something that I didn't know at the time, was that it used to be the site of a gas station owned by two brothers who had fought in World War II, who were actually on Force 136. If people don't know that, there were, you know, Chinese Canadian soldiers who were sent behind enemy lines, or were trained to. I don't think they actually went. So there was a great deep cultural significance to that empty parking lot, and a certain developer wanted to put a very large, very modern, a very culturally non-specific, something that didn't match what the heritage and history of the neighborhood was. And so for the first time ever, disparate groups from all over the neighborhood, from all over the city even, showed up to fight for Chinatown, to fight for this empty lot, because whatever was going to put there would change the dynamics of the community, would change what Chinatown was. And so it was, I would dare say, a fight for its very existence. That was the entry point for our documentary, because we realized that Chinatown was always under threat. The more research we did, the more we realized how this was just but one chapter in the story of how Chinatown kept itself as Chinatown. And whether it was from, you know, the race riots of the early 1900s to the freeway fight during the 1970s, Chinatown has always been a target. You know, Chinatown has always been a place where politicians and the powers that be thought that they could get away with, you know what, you know, they're not important. We're going to do what we want to do. And so Chinatown has had to fight. And the other thing about Chinatown, which was interesting, is like Chinatown wasn't just for Chinese people. Chinatown was for all kinds of people, because back in those days, Chinatown was next to Strathcona, and those communities were places for the people that couldn't fit in with the regular Canadians. And that's where they ended up living. And it was a community of, you know, misfits and unwanteds for the longest time, but they fought for the community, they fought for their homes. And that's the story that we wanted to tell. It was a historical look at a neighborhood that has a deep and rich history that mirrors this country and its multiculturalism.
Thanks for that the synopsis of the film. And you mentioned something I want to sort of go back to. You talk about an empty parking lot. I mean, again, you know, I'm actually quite surprised over the last just a couple of days. You know, 700 people have watched this film with a first chance to see it, and so, as you said, this is a fight about an empty parking lot. So I guess maybe I'll ask you is like, how did you even hear about 105 Keefer, and why? And again, you mentioned this kind of almost paradox of people fighting over not an old building, not a heritage building that's 200 years old or 300 years old or something like that. This is they're fighting. Someone I remember once said to me, "It's like they're fighting over nothing. There's nothing there." So how did you hear about it personally? And what about this empty parking lot? For you, what was striking about that as a story?
How I heard about it personally was that there had been news reports of, I remember specifically, it was a CBC news story about how people came out to protest a parking lot. So it was fascinating that why did they care so much? But as we dug deeper, it turned out that this place was kind of the last straw that broke the camel's back, right? Because there had been other developments on Main Street, the Bosa building and was it Westland? Well, anyways, very modern buildings that tore down historic parts of Chinatown to put up these, glass and steel towers that are very much, you know, modern, but also a little soulless, I guess, right? I mean, it's modern, they're nice, but they're not Chinatown. And then something actually that you had said to me once, Henry, was that, you know, it was because it's a parking lot, it's because it was almost like an empty canvas. It was what it could be become. It was about the future, you know, like what are we deciding Chinatown was going to be? And I think that's what the people who were fighting for it saw, you know, that's why there was such passion and emotion. Not and when I say passion and emotion, I mean also just from these disparate groups that never had come together before. And that to me was very fascinating, right? So
that's interesting. I mean, it's a kind of fight about the future. But then your film, you know, we had a chance to preview. It's also a lot about the past, and you mentioned it also in your intro that there's also this recurring, you know, that relationship between the past and the future. You know, what did by the time you finished this film, I mean, what was your sort of understanding of that kind of past and future? And you know, we often think of heritage as the stuff that's old and the things that are past, but you know, you're making a statement in some sense about the past and the future and its connections.
Yeah, I mean, wow, there's so many things to say about that. I mean, certainly the past provides us a guide to where we are going to go, or where, you know, we can't figure out who we are unless we know where we came from, you know. And I think that's an important thing, obviously, knowing what led us to this point. And what led us to this point is a lot of consternation and a lot of being under threat. And it's unfortunate, but I think it made this neighborhood, these people, more resilient and more understanding of pressure, I guess. And when I say pressure, it's like happens all the time, you know, like whether it's in one group fighting for justice and equality, whether it's, you know, the people of Chinatown or it's Black Lives Matter, people are looking for justice, looking for balance, looking for change. And you know, like you see at the end of the documentary that this Keefer, 105 Keefer, actually led to more discussions between people that never really talked before. You know, you had community members talking to Black Lives Matter activists, Indigenous activists, trying to figure out how do we move together as a community. Yes, it's called Chinatown, but a lot of people live in Chinatown. A lot of people live in this place that welcomes everyone. You know, it's not Marpole, it's not Shaughnessy. You know, it's Chinatown, right? And on top of that too, one thing about the past and the future, it's like, you know, some people think that you know, historical neighborhoods like Chinatown should be in amber, and I don't think so. It's a growing, changing organism of a community. So what's Chinatown in the future? Well, that's for us to decide. You know, is China in the future going to look like Hong Kong? You know, is it going to look like London? Is it going to look like, you know, what is it going to be? But I think we have, that's the hope and the potential that we can make it into something that we want it to be, right? And I think that's really exciting, personally. So
it makes me think of, as you were talking, I was thinking of that Joni Mitchell song and that line about, you know, paved paradise and made it a parking lot.
Parking lot.
You're talking almost the opposite. It's almost like that line should have been, you know, that the parking lot, and then what will paradise be in that place? It's like reading in. You talk to a lot of people in this film, and do you think that in some sense, after you talked to that 105 Keefer kind of forced them, or the threat of losing paradise or losing the parking lot led them to think of what is paradise? I mean, what is it that they're trying to fight for or trying to save? In a certain way, maybe you don't appreciate something until it's either gone or it's under threat. But I don't know. You went. I mean, I was going to ask you how many people you interviewed total for this film.
I think we interviewed almost 17 or 18 people, but not everyone made the documentary. That's the thing, right? And for not just for length reasons, but for things where it's like we felt that maybe it was off context of what we're trying to do, and maybe we'll put those interviews online one day. But one thing that struck me about a lot of the people that we talked to was that, like, they didn't, like, they grew up in Chinatown, but they were like, you know, Canadians like me, Chinese Canadians like me, who were born elsewhere. but Chinatown for us was kind of a representation of a link to who we were, who we are. Like it was. I wasn't born in China, but I know I'm Chinese. Right. But the closest thing I have to that relationship with who I'm culturally, historically supposed to be, or think I am, or I believe I am, is Chinatown, because like it's just like me, a Chinese guy in the Canadian world, Canadian land. There's like a Chinese community in a Canadian setting, and so I think a lot of the people who felt that they needed to defend Chinatown were these kind of younger, and when I say younger, people from like their 50s all the way to like teenagers who say, this is my place. There's no other place in Vancouver or even in Canada that I feel that I have such an affinity for, that I identify with so deeply. And that's why I think there was so many people that came out and said, no, I can't let this community die, because this is part of me. Even though they didn't grow up there, even though like some people would visit every weekend, there's a lot of stories of people coming there for like athletic activities, or grandma taking them to go to a store or whatever. But not many people said I lived there and grew up there. We all kind of grew up and lived outside Chinatown, but they still identified with Chinatown. So that was fascinating to me, that was the driver of so much passion and care.
You talked about the youth and how many people who showed up at public hearings, at the city council and things like that were young. And paradoxically, there was a lot of talk about elders and seniors, old people, and so that dynamic of young and old. I mean, what did you make of that as you talked to people and listened to them?
Well, a lot of the people that talked about how the elders were engaged, it felt like they were saying for the first time, the elders felt they were being listened to. That was a big deal. Like before, Chinese elders, why would city council care about anything a bunch of older Chinese people in Chinatown would say? But because there was this teamwork in place, like the elders had the passion and the knowledge and the wisdom, the youth had the resources and the ability to translate. That was a big thing. Translators, and not just translating, but also like translating, like, well, how do we do an application? How do we file a grievance? How do we, how do you navigate the bureaucracy of the city with like many cities that exist now? There's modern bureaucracies that, I would think if you're an older senior citizen, especially if your first language isn't English, how do you navigate that, right? So there's this kind of symbiotic relationship and a generational relationship too, because these elders represented Chinatown. They had lived there their whole lives, and losing Chinatown or losing them, if you lost one, you lose the other. And I think there was a passion to save not only Chinatown, but the homes of these seniors, the lives of these senior citizens. Because where were they going to go? Where could they afford to go? Vancouver's one of the most expensive cities in the world, and Chinatown was the last place they could afford to live and still buy groceries and have a decent standard of living. So that fight was very much a lot of care on care on the part of the younger people, but also the wisdom on the older, the wisdom of the older people to see that this was an existential threat, and to be passionate about it and show up for all these meetings and show up for all these hearings, it was a symbiotic relationship, I think.
You mentioned it's interesting, as you were talking about the affordability, there was a lot of talk about this was not just about Chinatown, and a lot of people who weren't directly tied to Chinatown, it seemed that in the way that your film saw it, it was also about something going on in the overall city, about affordability and gentrification, and yet this was the place that it all crystallized rather than some other spot. I mean, why do you think that happened? Why Chinatown? I mean, why wasn't this a fight over gentrification somewhere else in the city? The affordability crisis and housing, it might have been anywhere, but it ended up being, that this is the first time, I think, in history that a development permit was turned down in the city of Vancouver. There was the first time, even actually a rezoning was turned down multiple times at 3 days of public hearings, gumming up the city council and the work they do on a day-to-day basis. why Chinatown? I mean, what is that part? Was that part of something that for you was part of the story?
Well, I think there's two parts to that. I mean, one is part of our research was showing how much, if one of the topics of the documentary is about gentrification, then every city in North America has a decaying inner core that is, being subject to gentrification, like redevelopment, let's call it. And a lot of the Chinatowns in North America generally are in those urban cores, right? So a lot of it is just history, and a lot of it is just the nature of what Chinatowns in North America are. They're at the center of these towns, they're center of these cities. They're more likely to be closer to, just like in Vancouver, where Chinatown's right next to East Hastings, like one of the poorest areas in all of North America. And so there's this push, I think, by the powers that be to say, oh, that's an obvious blight in my city, I'm going to change it, right? And I think within that, I'm willing to say that there probably is some kind of prejudice, right? Because, oh, well, it's a bunch of minorities, like there is this kind of, oh, it's for the greater good, and it's a bunch of minorities. It's almost, I don't want to say an easy target, but it's an easier target.
Yeah.
It's just like if you're redeveloping an inner city neighborhood in Detroit, well, that's populated by 90% African Americans, they will probably say, oh, it's an easy target, right? And so I think Chinatown just is in the crossroads of all these aspects of, I don't want to say making it an easy target, but certainly the government and the municipal government picking an easier target. That's probably why it checks all those boxes. Like they'll probably fight less. And on top of that, in Vancouver's case, they had already not fought, or at least had failed in 2 fights before then because of those 2 big buildings on Main Street, right? So they thought, oh, this Keefer is going to be easy. Keefer will be a no-brainer, and of course it wasn't, right? Talk about not doing your research, right?
well, you talk about this long history, like as you said, not to fancy it up and say it's environmental racism, but this idea that you bring up, that in the freeway fight in the 70s, the barbecue beats, the fact that Chinatowns across North America, freeways seem to always go through in these various cities again and again, that and that therefore it's even more amazing that this fight, that there was a fight, and that you do put it into this long history of resilience and resistance, and tying in even Vancouver's current livable downtown to the fact that some people in Chinatown, Strathcona in the 1970s fought to block a freeway and made the city a better place. I mean, is that something that is in your mind was you referred to this history, not of just this kind of to me, that I always make fun of it with my students, is like the canned history, potted history, this thing like spam history in a can that's easy to eat. But for you, it struck me that you really wanted to tell a story of these recurring generations of young people fighting. Not to give away the story, but why did you go back in time in that way to talk to the people who had been part of the freeway fight or part of other struggles?
I think when you look at history, you don't realize how certain seemingly innocuous events can affect the current state of your world, our world, right? I mean, it sounds very obvious to say, but it's true. Like, you don't realize, some people may not realize, is because of the Strathcona fight, that stopping that freeway made Vancouver the greenest city in North America. Like if I wasn't involved, but the community hadn't stopped the freeway, I think it would have been just another big city with large freeways. Like look at Toronto. They got a big freeway that cuts right through, and at the south end of Spadina, I don't know if that damaged it at all, but it cut right through the center of town, and look at places like Boston or Seattle. I don't know, like, it just seems like that was the general trend in that era. And had Vancouver followed it, we would have lost this almost this environmental credibility that Vancouver has because there's so much green space here. Well, that's because there's no direct freeway going through the heart of the city, right? And so that's why I delved. I love history. I love finding out why are things the way they are now due to something that happened in the past. But then the story you find is always different from what you expected, right? So as we went back, as we understood, like for instance, once again, I'll mention the gas station. You know, not realizing, like, it's funny to me how the developers didn't just do a little digging to say, oh, this gas station was owned by two heroes, two guys who helped Chinese Canadians get the vote. I mean, that is just mind blowing, and to not even address it is shockingly just not just bad form, but just almost disrespectful. It's like, you know, at least you can do is talk about it because it is so important to us as a community. And even like, I bet you a lot of people don't even know that's the case. I think it's up to us to educate them, but also to stop a developer from just literally paving over and not talking about the significance of that place, right? And the history that happened here. And that's probably why there's so much that got us to this point, you know, like Chinese Canadians have always had, you know, like we've been treated as the perpetual outsiders for as long as I can remember. And we fought to become seen as Canadian as the next person, I would hope. And I think that's why a history of a place like Chinatown to me is so interesting, is because it is that fight. It's not just a fight for a community, it's a fight for acceptance within this larger community we call Canada, right? So that's why I want to do it. So.
Well, thanks. I mean, I think we've got some audience questions that I think are coming up.
Sure.
That sense of I think they're hearing what you're saying about what it means. And so I don't know if Tiffany, you feel comfortable asking the question yourself, but if not, why don't I ask it for you? So Tiffany asks, during the Chinatown Reimagined Forum that took place yesterday and today, speakers talked about a lost generation in Chinatown, where Chinatown activists are either young folks below 30 or Chinese seniors above 80. Like you're talking about the passion that did you also notice this when interviewing people for the film, that there was this kind of missing generation in some sense between, or did the 105 Keefer fight bring this lost generation back to Chinatown? And now I don't want to know if I'm not sure you want to age yourself or to tell you, like, if you're not under 30 or over 80, maybe I guess I feel like maybe I'm part of that lost generation then.
Yeah,
too.
maybe I am too. Well, I mean, that's really interesting. Now I have to chew through that point, you know, like, so we did interview older activists like, you know, the Shirley Chans of the world, and they were, you know, of course they've been around for every fight. And then the younger people we interviewed were generally under 40 is my guess. And it's interesting that there's no kind of, well, let me
missing middle of the sandwich kind of
well,
thing.
the middle of the sandwich to me, the people we did get as the middle of the sandwich, but they talked about, and it feels like it almost coincided with the Hong Kong influx, that was their time. And that, I don't know if that was a challenge to Chinatown, don't get me wrong, we do talk about that, but it was an interesting challenge because you got all these Cantonese people coming in. It's like, hey, great, but they went to Richmond. Oh, well, that's not what we wanted. But was that a threat to Chinatown? Right. Yes, maybe not. And then so maybe that generation didn't have a particular hard fight. Maybe I'm just throwing this out, Henry. Maybe you have another perspective.
I mean, it's interesting.
It's interesting.
It's really an interesting. I mean, you know, thanks Tiffany for bringing this, because I think it was I think Jeffrey Wong who of the Wong Association who actually kind of used that term. And, you know, for him, because he's at a, you know, he's younger, but for him at a place like the Wong Association and Clan Associations, I think that's why he kind of felt it, is that there's a missing generation from the Clan Associations that perhaps, as you said, never bonded with Chinatown in the same way.
Yeah.
Some of the young people through 105 Keefer have become really tied. So, I mean, it's an interesting kind of speculation about, you know, what was missing, what was missing in that wasn't there. And in some sense, I guess your film really talks about, it could have been a couple lost generations, that if there was no 105 Keefer fight, maybe there wouldn't be, these younger under 30 folks who got kind of fired up and
maybe you just hit the nail on the head there, Dr. Yu, because every generation, let's say, every group of people needed some kind of spark or event to coalesce around to get this kind of activist fervor going, right? So this generation, let's call it the people who are now 30-ish, whatever, having Keefer, that's their event. The people of Shirley Chan and that generation, they had the freeway fight in the 70s, right? And then before then, it would have been the 40s to 50s with the voting rights and that kind of thing. So and then there was the barbecue meat fight in the 80s, right? But then between that and now, like I said, there's the Hong Kong influx, but was that a threat? And I don't think people treated it as such. There was no keep the Chinese out. Well, that's why when we say that we're in Chinatown, right? So maybe that's what it was. There's a missing event in that time period, because almost like clockwork, every 10 to 20 years there was something, and then suddenly from the 80s till now, it really wasn't, other than a slow decline of Chinatown, right? So that was almost like a frog in the boiling pot situation there, because I don't think anyone really felt it until, Keefer, that's a problem, so.
Well, it's interesting. It's almost like you need that existential fight to galvanize people, to bring people together, to get them fired up. It was a freeway fight of the 70s, fighting for voting rights and just to be not a second-class citizen, but for inclusion. And then 105 Keefer. That sounds good to me. I'll take that as a historical theory. We have another question from, I don't know, Tyler, you want to ask it yourself?
Sure. Hi, Chester. So I had a question, just wondering whether or not you heard any perspectives that were from folks that were pro 105 Keefer. Kind of the context behind this is I find that with Chinatown organizing, one of the most difficult parts is just facilitating conversations between folks that are potentially coming from different lived experiences or different, kind of perspectives. And so you as a director, how do you navigate potentially conflicting perspectives?
That's a great question, because it's funny, like you said, like getting interview subjects that were on the other side that were not just pro development, but pro that particular project. It was I don't want to say hard, but I think how I pitched myself and the project was that we didn't have a horse in the race. We wanted to get the story up. The story was key and king, and we weren't trying to pursue a certain agenda or perspective, and that sets other people at ease, right? And to say, because the lawsuit against the city is still going on, right? And there's still a lot of legal barriers for them to actually say, we could do another documentary in 3 years and you'll get the inside story. but for now, to get a balanced viewpoint and to get people to even say anything, I had to approach it from a very objective angle and a respectful one. And I think that was what set people at ease, and they were willing to talk about it. And they self-censored a lot of times. I always said, talk about what you feel is comfortable. And they would actually stop, they would say something and they would stop themselves and say, oh, wait, I can't say that. And that's fine. You can keep talking however you want to, right? And because we gave them that kind of comfort, we got different perspectives. And I think that's what made, the documentary feel pretty balanced. So.
I appreciate that kind of difficulty, because as I said, this was a very conflicted, and divisive in some ways, fight, and yet also galvanizing in the ways that you were talking about before. It brought, you could say, a generation together, and yet there were a lot of really disagreements about what the future of Chinatown should be. And yet, in looking back, we're probably in a time when we're really brought together. Especially, I think a lot of the younger people that showed up at Chinatown Reimagined the last 2 days. I want to take the chance, and then we'll come back to some of the questions. So keep posting questions, everyone who's out there who's listening. But I want to bring in Stanley and Patrick, the two students. Stanley Chia, who is completed his actually history's master while working on the film with you, and so congratulations, Stanley, for finishing his master's in history, and Patrick, who is doing his history honors thesis again while working on this film, and he was also complete. But yeah, what was it like for the two of you working on this film? Just maybe Patrick, you can go first, and then Stanley.
Yeah, I think it was a really cool experience, especially as you were saying about this, the fact that every generation sort of has this one mobilizing moment. And for me, when I was doing my honors thesis, it was, of course, about the anti-W5 movement in 1979, 1980. And when I did a lot of these oral histories, I was doing at the same time, I was doing these interviews for the Clash on Keefer documentary. So it sort of felt like both of these projects at the same time were complementing each other, where it was, even though they're totally different time periods, totally different people, I mean, there were so many similarities in the way that people were talking about, the moment they're a part of, the movements they're a part of. It was honestly pretty inspiring to see, like how every generation has this attachment to this moment, and how important it was for them when not only, when the fight was done and, they sort of achieved that short-term goal, but then how they built on it and how they built, new foundations, new associations, new ways of doing things. And they moved forward. And I think that's how, history progresses in general, but it's really interesting to have that human level, right? Where, we do those oral histories and talk to people and, find out their perspective as well. So yeah, it was both personally touching, but also really interesting from a historical perspective too.
All right. Thanks, Patrick. It's interesting that came up a little bit in your film too, that in some sense those earlier fights did change Chinatown. It did change the city, and in fact some of that vision about what Chinatown should be did get instituted, and then the people got older. I mean, it was very interesting to see Shirley Chan, the pictures of her when she was a young UBC student, radical, wearing black leather sort of jacket, and you could just see this was a woman not to be trifled with. And then by the time you're interviewing her, she's, an elder. And so that the young people become the older generations still in the fight, so to speak. But when you talked about the passion of the elders and you talked about the passion of the young people now, but really the film does a great job of showing, the set of young people of the 70s. Stanley, maybe you can share what your experience. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. I guess it was kind of like weird for me because I'm like a total outsider to Vancouver, Chinatown. Like I moved from Toronto to Vancouver in 2018, and so that was just about when the 105 Keefer fight was just wrapping up. So I totally didn't know about it until I got roped into this project. So yeah, it was a deep dive into like Vancouver Chinatown's history. Of course, I took some classes while I was an undergraduate student at Toronto about like the freeway fight, the barbecue meats fight. So to me, it was also really inspiring to be able to like interview Shirley Chan and speak to community activists and actually like hear from the people I've been reading so much about, and actually, yeah, engaging them and learning about how activism and community resistance works in Vancouver Chinatown. I thought that was just like a really great learning experience for me.
I'm going to ask you, both of you, and then I want to get back to some of the audience questions as well. How did this change you? And maybe I'll ask that question of you, Chester, a little later afterwards. But how did this experience of working on the film and what you found out, did it? I guess I'm assuming that it changed you, but did it, or how did it impact you in some ways? Stanley or Patrick, go ahead. Whoever, if I'll give you a second.
I can go first. I guess it really made me want to get more involved in Vancouver Chinatown, like actually participate and take the time to go down to the neighborhood and like participate in events like the Fire Dragon Festival, Light Up Chinatown, the Dragon Boat Festival. And yeah, this is my 7th year in Canada consecutively. And they have Dragon Boat in Toronto as well, but I was always thinking like, oh, that's a Chinese Canadian thing. I'm not gonna like bother to go and check it out. I've been in Vancouver for like 3-4 years now, and I never thought to go out and like check it out until like this year. So yeah, joining this project really made me want to get more involved.
Thanks, Stanley. I know, Patrick.
Yeah, same as Stanley. I mean, like, I really want to get more involved in Vancouver Chinatown after this. I was really interesting to, learn really in depth about these histories and talk to people who are actually involved in it. And I think it really gives you a better sense of place, right? Like when you go to Vancouver Chinatown, you can feel that history. Like when you see the buildings that people were in front of, like all the photos that are all the archival documents that we all reviewed, you can sort of tell that people have lived here. It's a lived place, and it's been like that for generations. And I think that sense of place is super important. But beyond that, I think like it's interesting to also have then the oral part of it where, Stanley and I and Chester, we were all involved in asking questions. I think the most important part I learned was, the importance of listening, right? Like you ask a question, but like, it's not like, even though we had a script in the end, I mean, in the end, it was just really asking these questions and listening to them and then building off of what they were saying. So really being reciprocal in these conversations, like just having their voices be heard and like, the interviewees, I mean, just letting them talk sometimes and not asking a question even, that was really important. So yeah, the importance of listening, not just talking.
Thanks. And I want to thank Chester again for, I'm sure it would have been easier to just do this with the crew that you're used to, but taking on a couple students, and really helping mentor them. But I saw you nodding a little bit about this sort of when Patrick was talking about asking questions and listening, and not sort of just plowing through. Is there a reason why you were?
Well, no, because like when Patrick and Stanley started off, and we started early on, they were sticking to a script. And then as I watched him get more used to how I interview, and I treat interviews as very conversational, and not interrupting. Like I listen to what they say and I'm like, wait. What did you just say? Tell me more about that, right? And that's how you dive, right? And you dive and you dive and you dive and you eventually find like, that's what you meant, and that's what creates great interviews. And after a while, after I didn't even need to be there anymore, Stanley and Patrick were doing that on their own, and so that's a skill, like you said, Patrick, as you listen. It's not just much listening, it's also listening and going, oh, there could be a connection there. There's something I can really, it could be something interesting. And sometimes it's a dead end, like, oh, they didn't go anywhere, right? But sometimes you find gold. And that's a lot of times that's what we had to do with a lot of these interviewees is just not just talk to them, listen to them, but engage them and guide them to places that they wouldn't have considered without you, right? And that's what a good interviewer does. So, and that's why I nodded, because like Patrick and Stanley learned that as we went along, and yeah, it was great. And no, I think they were invaluable. They were the ones who helped set everything up and did research. I really appreciated their involvement. I don't think we could have done it without them. So.
Well, thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Stanley, for again throwing yourselves into this project, and Chester for bringing them along. So
of course.
It's you can really see it, the film's a labor of love, and a lot of passion went into it, and a lot of the people who obviously shared their time to be interviewed. That's a lot of people for a series of interviews. I want to go move it a little bit, and actually I think this was prompted a little bit by something that when you talked about the Hong Kong Chinese, and I kind of I don't know if Joshua you want to ask this question yourself or okay, I'll go ahead. So Joshua asks, I understand there was a fight against Tinseltown, now International Village, when it was built. Although the Hong Kong Chinese were not really viewed as a threat to Chinatown in that same existential way as a freeway or gentrification, there were and are competing views of Chinese modernity and what the future Chinatown could look like. My question is somewhat speculative, so I guess you're asking you to speculate. But what kind of fight do you think there would be if 105 Keefer wasn't a condo, but something like Aberdeen Centre at Richmond or something, so something that maybe is even more of a threat as to being an alternative, a way of doing it. That it's interesting because I think of Hong Kong style cafes, cha cha tang from the 70s, and like the Goldstone, the Boss and stuff. But what if it had been an Aberdeen Mall kind of, which Tinseltown I think was hoping to be.
And I get that.
Well,
let me answer that with an analogy. Yeah. So my parents came to Canada in the 70s. Mm-hmm. And so they brought with them their version of Hong Kong Cantonese here, right? And it's funny, then when they visited 10, 20 years later, the language in Hong Kong changed, right? Like the Cantonese there changes, where I noticed that the Cantonese here kind of got stuck in amber with my parents, right? Because they didn't develop, there's only a few of them, I grew up in Alberta. So their Cantonese almost was frozen in time. Whereas like language is as you know, a living, breathing organism that changes of pop culture and development and other ideas. And so the Cantonese in Hong Kong changed, like it as it should, right? It become they added different English words and they made them Chinese, whatever, all kind of different terms that my parents would never use, and it was just fascinating to me just seeing the difference, right? So to apply that to an answer to that question is like, so the version of modern Chinese buildings or culture or whatever would be so different from what the people here would think, because we grew up differently, you know, whether it's like, oh, well, I want to keep Chinatown. Well, hang on. Have you been to Hong Kong and see how modern and different and those kind of, like, what they expect is, well, Chinese. We might not see as Chinese, but it's very Chinese to them. And they want to make Chinatown Chinese. Well, whose Chinese are we talking about, right? And so is that an existential threat? Or is it something where we have to talk about and go, well, we want to preserve Chinatown. We also want it to grow and continue and change like an organism that survives and thrives. Maybe we need to do that. Or do we do something else? I don't know. I mean, it'd be interesting to see what would happen if, like you said, a Cantonese Hong Kong developer put something in 105 Keefer. Like, would the fight have been worse, better, more fervor, less fervor? I don't know. It's interesting. It's a really interesting question.
It sort of strikes me that that's one of the themes of the last couple of days, actually, you know, as I put our conversation right now into the context of this reimagining of Chinatown, that and what was missing, let's say, why 105 Keefer, that vision of Chinatown as luxury condos was not something that was perhaps acceptable to so many people, that you know, it seems to, and your remarks, I think, raise this, is that it's got to be a living community that somehow is respecting the people who are already there. That is a conversation. But what you were saying that came out in your interviews and in your film, I think it comes out strong, is this wasn't a conversation. You know, this was a kind of, here's a blueprint of what we want to put in there. And they didn't talk to anyone on the ground. They didn't talk to to what was maybe needed, wanted, or even to the disagreements. I don't know if that's a fair way to put it, that a living community really needs, in some sense, a continuing conversation about what's coming up and what people want, but it's got to be a conversation.
Well, and that's why, like I said, like in 2 or 3 years, we could do a sequel about this documentary and hopefully talk to the developer, because I'd love to ask them, who did you talk to? And not in an insulting kind of way, but like, who did you talk to? And what did you say? Like, did you honestly have this kind of broad, you know, base of knowledge that everyone put in something and that's what you came up with? Or did you talk to like the people you wanted to talk to, and this is what you think because you probably had an idea of what you wanted, and you talked to the people that reinforced that idea, but that doesn't help anybody, right? Like, if you had an honest conversation, and maybe they did, and this is still what they came up with, I don't know, right? That's why in 2 or 3 years, like, having an honest discussion with the developer, be very curious to see what their answers are. But to me, it seems like once again, I don't know what was in their heads. I'm not inside the room, but to me, it seemed like they talked to the people that reinforced the ideas they had. If they had went around and talked to everybody and tried to find a consensus, I bet you it would have been fairly accepted, right? You know, talk about the historical significance, talk about maintaining cultural identity, talk about all those things. But I don't think those conversations, or at least didn't happen in a thoughtful, meaningful way, you know, so.
Well, and that comes perhaps across lawsuit or no. It does seem to be something that pops up in your film. And so again, I'm going to encourage everyone who has, if you weren't one of the 700 who took advantage of the preview moment, and you'd like to see the film before again that preview opening, that again, thanks to Chester, who I know that you asked of TELUS that they allow this kind of preview moment, especially to a lot of the people who are involved in the film who were interviewed. So thank you to Chester for allowing some of that. But if you still have a few hours, anybody listening right now, to watch the film if you haven't yet. And then it'll come out later, and you can watch the premiere with everyone else. But I guess I'll ask that as a kind of closing. Where the hour's almost up, but we hopefully there is that next film made in 3 years, and you'll discover more. But I guess I'll ask this question about how did working on this film change you? I mean, what was its impact on you? What did you learn from this?
Well, I'll tell another story, I guess. I grew up, I'm originally from Alberta, so I grew up in Edmonton. And so I was one of 2 or 3 Chinese kids in my class up to grade 7 or 8, and so I was always the outsider, right? And our Chinatown in Edmonton, if anybody's been there, is not even a Chinatown, it's more of a China street. And it was very limited. The population of Chinese people there was small, right? So I never felt like there's a place where I could run to say, oh, I belonged, or there was a place where I could find myself, like it was a Chinese Canadian, right? Like someone born here but looks like this and speaks Cantonese to his parents, and all those things. There was not that many people. And then I moved to Toronto for a few years, and it's different. To me, it didn't feel as long-lived as Vancouver's Chinatown. Vancouver's Chinatown is special because all the Chinese people, other than Victoria, of course, all the Chinese people who moved to Canada invariably went through there, landed there, had something to do with it, whether it was like someone lived there and the relative brought over another relative, and they didn't maybe go to Vancouver, but they went somewhere else. But there was a link, and Vancouver's Chinatown, to me, when I finally moved here, it was a place where I went, oh, okay, I'm not that weird. I'm not an outsider. I'm a Canadian, and this place proves it. This place proves that I do belong. And yeah, maybe we had to fight to prove that we belong, but we certainly did. Just like many other communities and cultures, that we all fought to be part of this Canadian mosaic, right? And so, if anything, it showed me that being Chinese Canadian is Canadian. There shouldn't be a hyphen, and Chinatown's history proves it. That's what I learned, at least.
Thanks for that really eloquent way of, in some sense, capturing that difficult thing to put about what does Chinatown mean to each of us, and to you, we had several people, William Lau and Sean C from Edmonton, actually, talking about the challenges that Edmonton's Chinatown is facing, and there are these existential threats. And we had others at Chinatown Reimagined talking about Montreal, and some were from Toronto, and some from San Francisco Chinatown. And it's interesting that what you raised as this belonging, a place to belong, that long historically Chinatowns have been places of refuge and sanctuary for people who didn't belong, not just Chinese, but others who didn't belong, who whether it was urban Aboriginal or Indigenous peoples off reserve, fleeing, and sometimes to urban areas, and Chinatowns were haven African Canadians. Hogan's Alley it's very difficult to say. There's Hogan Alley, and then there's a street, and then there's Chinatown. Strathcona. That these are really mixed, inclusive, diverse places. And so, in that sense, even the term Chinatown is perhaps a misnomer. But thanks so much, Chester, for sitting with us tonight, sharing. Thank you so much, for involving Patrick and Stanley in this project, and really, actually, I'd say, for helping tell this story, this important story, as your documentary. But really, this is the first cut. You know, we as historians, we talk about the first cut of history. You know, some important thing happens, and then there's that first version of it, that first attempt to tell the story of it. Has everybody else is going to have to now, you know, go and say, well, your version of that story is wrong. So
that's totally fine. That's how we all grow. That's how we grow and change and learn the real history, the truth.
Real true story. Well, and you may be doing the film that says, well, actually, you know, this is the complete story. 3 years.
Sorry, guys. Ignore the last.
Right. Yeah, that was that first cut was just the first cut. But we look forward to it, and we thank you for actually taking that time and bringing your passion to giving us that first cut of the story of 105 Keefer, the clash on Keefer. And so our thanks, Chester, to you and your team. And thank you, everybody, tonight for joining us in this conversation. And we look forward to, you know, seeing it go public. Those who saw the preview and were lucky enough to see the preview, we know that this film was going to be seen by a lot of people. And hopefully that story of the passion of those people who you know, David and Goliath, as you said in the film, there's a David and Goliath story of and David won. So
won. Absolutely. And thank you again for your hospitality, Henry, and thanks to Patrick and Stanley again for all your help, and of course Jenny as well, and UBC, and couldn't have done it without you, honestly. And I just feel honored to be able to tell one little story about my cultures, my people's history, and feel very grateful. So thank you.
Thank you, Justin. And thanks again to Jenny, Victoria, Stanley, Patrick, all those who also have been, Tyler, especially for having been the manager of Chinatown Reimagined and brought it into being, and hopefully now can go sleep, because he and Jenny have been really working hard along with the team of students who brought Chinatown Reimagined together. But we're so happy that we could, you know, have that chance to show the story of Clash on Keefer as part of that, because we probably would not be at this moment if it wasn't for the fight over 105 Keefer and bringing it together and galvanizing a generation. So our thanks again to you, Chester, for telling that story. And
thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining tonight. And you know, as I said, one last chance, go watch the film with the preview of you.
Or else wait till November.
Or wait till November. Thanks. Good night, everyone.